Welcome to After the Homily. I'm Dr. Chris Stroud. Have you ever had questions after the homily? Have you ever wished that you could sit down with the priest and talk about the long list of things that you felt certain would be in the homily that somehow didn't make it in there? Well, this is the podcast for you. We cover everything from literature to politics, church teaching to church architecture. And it doesn't matter if you're an everyday Catholic or maybe a Christmas and Easter, or maybe you can't remember the last time you went to Mass Catholic. We're here for you. And today I'm joined by Father Daniel Schiedt. He is the pastor at St. Vincent de Paul Catholic Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend. Father, welcome.
Great to be here, Chris.
Yeah, we are now setting 2 days, I guess, into Lent.
The glory of these 40 days.
Right. You know, I thought it would be fun, if you don't mind, to start with just a little bit of accounting. This seems to come up a great deal about how do we get 40 days with the calendar the way that it works in Lent?
Well, the 40 is more of a symbolic number. So from Ash Wednesday through Wednesday of Holy Week, actually into the morning and daytime of Holy Thursday, that's what qualifies as Lent. And so if you don't count Sundays of Lent, you can manage your way to 40.
To 40. But that'd be great trivia. You know, when does Lent officially end?
It is at the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday evening.
At the completion.
Yes.
Wow, that's good trivia and important. Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
But here we are, as we said, beginning our Lenten journey. And you spoke in the homily this past Sunday about prayer, about fasting, and about almsgiving. So this is the first of a multi-series for Lent, as we did last year. And we're going to start with fasting today.
Yes. And so for the Gospel of Ash Wednesday, the Lord specifically refers to prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, and then sets the conditions in which those are fruitfully engaged. He speaks of secrets and rewards. So we're to do these, as he says, in secret, and our rewards will come from beyond this world to embrace this world. And by that, he wants to liberate us from what other people are thinking about us, putting on an external show. The secret that he's referring to is the cultivation of the interior life. And the rewards, he wants us to think beyond just the predictable praise that would come from doing humanly heroic things. He wants us to enter into the Father's delight at our embracing what he, Jesus, is doing and what he's doing in us.
Wow. I remember, and listening to you, I'm reminded, when I was a brand new Catholic going through RCIA, as we're in the Easter season, and hearing about fasting, and thinking, I didn't know that was a Catholic thing. I thought that was sort of an evangelical, Pentecostal sort of something, and yet it's so fundamentally Catholic. But I wonder how many other people feel that way.
Well, one answer would be that the living roots of who we are come from the promises that the Lord made to the people of Israel. So in the Old Covenant, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving were given a certain specificity and commanded to be lived in a particular way. So one might say cross-culturally, the value of prayer and fasting and almsgiving has been universally recognized, perhaps atrophied, forgotten in our own time. But in terms of our identity, who we are, the living roots of who we are, the living roots of our faith, have fasting in their very genetics.
Wow.
So Christ himself begins after his baptism in the Jordan with 40 days of prayer and fasting. And like any faithful Jew, he would have observed the the liturgical rhythms of the Jewish year. And we can talk a little bit later in the podcast about some of the differences that he himself brought as God in our flesh, how he brought the rhythms of feasting and fasting to fulfillment in his own person in the founding of the church. And from the beginning of the church, fasting has been an essential part of what it is to be a Christian. In fact, the early church identified from the very beginning that Wednesdays and Fridays were to be days of fasting. Wednesday, the day on which the plotting of the Lord being handed over, one can think of the agony in the garden, and Friday for the day of his saving death for us, for our salvation.
I think most people probably think of Fridays and probably don't necessarily think of Wednesdays.
Correct. But in the earliest documents of the church, beyond the sacred scriptures, for example, the Didache, which is the teaching of the 12, it explicitly refers to the Christian practice of the apostolic practice of Wednesdays and Fridays as fasting days.
And then in Lent, everyone knows we fast. We fast on Fridays in Lent.
Yes. Well, actually, we don't even do that.
Not the appropriate term, is it?
Sure.
So that's what I was going to ask
in
you.
our portion of Western Catholicism, the 2 days of fasting that are commanded would be Ash Wednesday and Good Friday.
Right.
The Fridays of Lent would be also days of abstaining from meat.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, the difference between abstaining from something and fasting.
Yes. And oftentimes this is where the conversation in Catholic circles stalls for several reasons. First of all, we're trying to figure out, well, what does fasting mean? And so then in the recent legislation of the church, one full meal, and then you can have 2 smaller meals, but they can't add up to a second full meal. And you're thinking, what does that mean
Starts
in
to
my
sound
life?
rather legalistic.
And,
Yep.
yeah. And then the other dimension is it's so pathetic. I mean, it's just so anemic that we're squabbling, trying to get the best deal out of 2 days of the year. And other traditions, one thinks of Islam, have maintained a much more robust understanding of longer periods of fasting. This would be a separate discussion, but I'll just throw it out there for those who want to do the historical research. These practices that we identify with Islam, the praying 5 times a day and the long stretches of fasting, those actually have Christian roots. And so, Muhammad, when he came into contact with the different Christian and Jewish caravans, this is what he was drawing on. In any case, it's just to reaffirm the fact that longer and shorter periods of fasting are intrinsic to what it is to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And I think it's our responsibility at this moment in the church's history to recover what has been lost, misunderstood, forgotten.
Yeah. I mean, because I guess it would be fair to say maybe pre-Vatican II, or at least in that area, I think it was very cultural for Catholics to abstain, not fast, from meat on all Fridays.
Right.
And that seems to have sort of fallen off. But then I think there's a resurgence or a rebirth of that in some areas.
At the time of the council, the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, some of the council fathers wanted to simplify some of the legalisms around fasting and abstinence. And for example, they taught that Fridays remain days of penance, but it's possible to substitute for abstaining from meat some other penitential practice, which sounds very expansive in theory, but in practice, it actually removed from the ordinary Catholic's practice of the faith the the habitus, the habit of fasting.
And then there's fasting that we do in a liturgical sense. But then I think you're going to talk about fasting beyond that in terms of just our prayer life.
Well, I would put it this way. There seems to be a resurgence at this moment in history that's quite interesting about people recovering an understanding and a practice of fasting that isn't necessarily tied to the liturgical rhythms of the church and is often tied simply to physical, emotional health. And that's all to the good insofar as it gets us exploring the deeper things. And it might be a good place to start right there, distinguishing fasting from dieting. So we tend to think of, well, going without food, going without certain types of drink, that has all sorts of wellness benefits for me, maybe even mindfulness benefits for me. And I can lose some weight during Lent, and I can look better, and I can feel better. All of those incentives, hey, if it puts fuel in the tank to make some changes, really good. And in fact, I'd recommend a few books for those who are looking for just really good books on thinking about food intentionally. And here, my go-to author is Michael Pollan. He would be of secular Jewish background. He's written a number of books. One of them is called In Defense of Food, an Eater's Manifesto.
And viewers, we'll put all of these in the program notes with a photograph, so they're easy to find if you want to search them out for your Lenten work.
And we won't be going into detail about this, but it's just to throw them out there as some points of reference. And he makes the claim in this book that there are three basic rules. Eat food rather than food-like substances, mostly plants, and not too much. And it's just a beautiful way to cut through the fads and the all sorts of counterclaims to get back to basics. For those who want an even simpler version of this book, he has also written a sequel called Food Rules, an Eater's Manual. And this is delightful because you also get pictures, but he breaks it down into all sorts of like sub-principles, like don't buy what goes in your body from the place where you buy what goes in your car. So just as a general principle, using the gas station to fuel up one's body,
Not a good fuel.
generally not a good thing. Anyway, it's a delightful book, very thought-provoking. A classic book of his, which I think it's his best, is called The Omnivore's Dilemma. We could do a whole series of podcasts on this. The subtitle is A Natural History of Four Meals. And this has been a bestseller, but he essentially purchases the ingredients for four distinct meals. One of them is entirely fast food, and he traces the ingredients all the way back to their source. So picture a McDonald's meal, and he goes to figure out where the potatoes came from. The second meal that he investigates is what's called, he calls industrial organic. So he goes to a place like Whole Foods, purchases the foods there for what would constitute a meal, and then he traces those all the way to their source. The third meal is what he calls locavore. So all the ingredients for this meal have to be found within 100 miles of where he lives. I suppose if you live in California, it's going to be a different meal than Indiana. But this all is a prep for the fourth meal, which is one that he entirely hunts and gathers himself. So he goes after the boar, he collects the spores for the leaven to make the bread, etc. And what's so amazing at the end of the book, at the conclusion, he gathers his friends at his table for this meal that he's hunted and gathered himself. And he's not a religious man. And he feels welling up from within him this reverent, transcendent feeling of thanksgiving for what's happening. I mean, he's filled with awe and gratitude at what he's eating. And I couldn't help but think that he's not far from the kingdom of God, because there at that moment is the realization that who I am, what I eat, the ones with whom I eat, and the meaning of it all are meant to go together. So all of this, in a sense, would be like the beginning of our discussion, insofar as fasting can only be understood properly in terms of feasting. And for feasting to be what it is, this side of paradise, it requires fasting as part of it. Feasting and fasting are married. And unfortunately, all of us live in our culture as children of divorce. They've been divorced. But if you look in sacred scripture, in the book of Genesis, fasting and feasting are united. No sooner does God plant the garden, put Adam and Eve in it, what does he do? He gives it all to them. And he says, you can eat of the fruit of all the trees.
The feast.
So we've got just universal feast. It's all a gift. And then the Lord specifies, but of the tree in the middle of the garden, you are not to eat. So within this command of feasting is also this gift of fasting. And of course, we know how that works out. Adam and Eve seize the fruit, consume it on their terms rather than the Lord's, and then it leads to alienation. Fast forward to the end of sacred scripture, book of Revelation. How does it end? With a feast, the wedding feast of the Lamb. And what was divorced, humanity and divinity, is reunited. And Christ's passion on the cross, his sacrificial death, during which he says, I thirst, Jesus' fast, is wedded to this feasting that redeems us. And we're meant to be part of that. So the church's whole liturgical tradition is actually a participation in the life, death, and resurrection of the Lord. That's the big picture, which is far beyond just one full meal, and the two smaller meals can add up to a second full meal.
Yeah.
We can specify what fasting and feasting means, but we have to see the big picture first.
It's funny, sometimes this is one of those times that I'm reminded, whatever Mother Church's teaching is, sometimes later on a secular explanation comes along, and people had no idea that it had its roots in church teaching.
Yes.
But yeah, as you referenced, now there's a craze with fasting and all of the health benefits of so-called intermittent fasting and what it does for the brain cells and all of these things. And yet, to your point, we've been taught to fast and to feast since the beginning.
Yes. My final book recommendation, and we could actually do some podcasts on this book alone. I think it's the best one out there. It's by an author, Catholic professor at Catholic University of America, J. Richards, and it is titled Eat, Fast, Feast, and the subtitle is Heal Your Body While Feeding Your Soul, A Christian Guide to Fasting. And obviously, titles sell books. So it comes off as a kind of self-help book, but it's actually a reintroduction for really anyone who's interested into the living tradition of of the church's rhythms of fasting and feasting, and why it's important, but even how to enter it. And he's brought together a lot of the recent medical science of understanding how fasting works, why it's beneficial, and and how it's a good in itself. But he takes the good of fasting and integrates it into a human context that is ultimately profoundly Christian.
So, in terms of just a faithful person trying to make their life better, understanding fasting, understanding this rhythm of fasting and feasting, that sort of seems like a body of work. But then, specific to Lent and our Lenten practices, we're talking about fasting maybe in a different way. Is that fair to say?
Sure. But I think it's important to start. In fact, Jay Richards points this out. Every single one of us fasts every day when we sleep.
Sure.
So we're spending part of the day consuming food and drink and part of the day not.
Sure.
So intrinsically, there must be something good about that rhythm.
Yeah.
The fact that in the life of the church, in a week's time, Sunday is always a day of feasting. It's the Lord's Day. And the 2 days, Wednesdays, Fridays, generally, are days of fasting, traditionally understood. So even in a weekly rhythm, one's ingestion of food and drink is not meant to be homogeneous, just same old. Even though in our culture, that's what we've become. We've become kind of suburbanized grazers, and we just drift from thing to thing, and we're less and less satisfied. The quality of it is more and more diminished. Our health is suffering from it. And so what the church is doing is taking seriously these rhythms that we live daily, weekly. Then in the case of the seasons of the church, one thinks of our Advent preparations for Christmas, our Lenten preparations for Easter. The church is proposing longer stretches of preparation for the greatest feasts. Even though in Advent, most people don't observe that as much as they observe pre-Christmas celebrations of Christmas. That would be a separate discussion. So on the one hand, you, given your line of work, even before birth, the child is there, and there can be a certain celebration in an anticipatory way of this new human life carried in secret. But what's happened in our situation with the fasting and feasting around Christmas time is that we indulge too early, too much, so that by the time December 25th, the beginning of the Christmas season arrives, people are sick and bloated and ready to move on. So that also would need to be corrected by the church's liturgical rhythms.
But thinking back to what you said about we all fast, from probably 8 to 12 hours naturally. I mean, if you look at human history, there was a natural eating pattern. We would sort of feast or gorge ourselves maybe on an animal or something, but there may not be food for days and days, maybe longer periods of time where it was just water. And yet we all survived and did really well. That's why we're sitting here.
Exactly.
So this is not something that was just sort of invented. It's very, very natural for...
Yes. No, and in this respect, we're living in a very anomalous time of human history. Most human beings who've ever lived would look at our situation. Maybe for the first 5 minutes, they would be in shock, filled with envy. But then they would look closer and say, this is really, really wrong.
We're drowning in calories.
Well, I mean, they would just look at how sad so
Yeah.
many people are, and how the ingestion of food and drink actually isn't serving health, but is attacking it. And yet, companies and governments don't seem to have the power to regulate that. And what does it even mean to regulate that at the governmental level? So it's just to say that what the church is proposing is, from the standpoint of being an expert in humanity, as Pope St. Paul VI famously said, the church is an expert in humanity. And recalling us to a more intentional relation to food and drink is, at the most fundamental level, making sure that food and drink are serving us rather than us serving them. And ultimately, we ourselves are serving the Lord by what we eat and drink, rather than making what we eat and drink a substitute for the Lord.
So how do we take these principles into Lent? Whether
Yes.
that's abstaining on Fridays, or are thinking of fasting on Good Friday, or
Yes.
thinking of our prayer life and our prayer commitments as part of the prayer, fasting, and almsgiving.
Yes. Just a few practical insights. I realize we've been very theoretical up to now. Um, the first practical insight is actually to bring our current patterns of eating and drinking to prayer. So considering them in prayer. And that can also include who we're eating with and who we're not eating with. Because food is actually meant also to serve conviviality. In this respect, the microwave has done us no favors, because it's fooled us into thinking, I could have whatever food I want in the shortest amount of prep time, individually packaged, so I don't have to rely on anybody else. That's the devil's workshop there. So the first practical tip, instead of feeling guilty about one's current situation, my life is a mess and I'm just going to force the holy diet and white knuckle it, to actually bring to prayer currently where we're at in terms of our eating and drinking. And then to ask the Lord to illuminate what's at the root of that. And I think that for many people, the eating and drinking is untethered from being with other people. And it's also driven by anxiety rather than by real hunger and real thirst. So a lot of times food and drink become more about stress relief, very short-term stress relief,
And
rather than,
sustenance,
and even rather than authentic enjoyment, where a good test of this is, to ask the Lord in prayer, Lord, when I'm eating and drinking, am I regularly, habitually, simultaneously ingesting meaning? Am I, whether it's reading while one eats, or having a good conversation while one eats, or some context where I'm also feeding on truth and goodness and beauty, rather than just food and drink in isolation.
It almost sounds we could simplify that by saying the difference between food and a meal.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was growing up, we had to have supper together as a family every single night,
Which is
without
unthinkable
exception.
today, right?
I know.
Yeah.
But that provided the context for understanding what food and drink are for, what they're meant to serve. And I remember my parents saying, you could stay at the table as long as you want. When you're finished, you can leave whenever you're finished. And my parents would talk for hours at the table. And as we got older, we spontaneously just hung out and stayed longer And and that was a great gift. So, the first practical tip as we're getting our bearings is to bring where we're currently at to prayer, asking the Lord to show us what seems to be driving things, what seems to be missing. And then maybe a next step is to do the kind of discernment that Michael Pollan helps us with. The things that I'm putting in my body that aren't helpful, how can I put those to the side? The things that I need to put in my body that are helpful, how can I include that? But with that question also has to come the context. Lord, who can help me in this? Just in terms of taking meals together, even just talking with another person about habits and having good conversation that supports what one's doing, that is tremendously important. And in terms of what Jesus counsels, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, it's a way of discerning the connection between fasting and almsgiving. Because what we're doing when we're eating well is we're actually giving other people our time, and we're sharing their life. And that love in the family is quite pleasing to God, because our Heavenly Father wants the family to be together too.
Yeah, I mean, culturally, it is disappointing what's happened with family meals, isn't it?
Yeah. And if the church is the family of families, it's our responsibility to receive this gift from the church, ultimately from the Lord, and to pass it on, to invite other people into it. So again, let's say that this prayer actually prompts us to want to make some changes. Well, maybe a next step, we identify those days in the church year on the liturgical calendar that are set aside for feasting. We mark them. The holy days of obligation, the highest forms of feasts that are called solemnities, we mark them. So, for example, in Lent, the Solemnity of St. Joseph, March 19th, mark it, feast on it. March 25th, Solemnity of the Annunciation, mark it, celebrate it. But then that begs the question, who are we going to invite to share this feast with us? So it's not just the good foods, the good beverages, but it's also who is going to enjoy this good with me, and how is that communal context going to help me grow in my authentic enjoyment of this meal. And before you know it, like, this actually starts to reshape a life. And it's been the wisdom of the church that to enjoy the feast more, it's good to fast beforehand. This is not rocket science. So the day before, to simplify radically one's eating and drinking is a preparatory exercise, and it's also like living a little bit of Christmas Eve, where we're waiting for the joy of opening the Christmas present. So fasting, seen in this light, fasting is never starvation or deprivation. It's not self-hatred inflicted on us by lack of food or drink. Rather, it's the decision to forego for a time a good for a greater good. And that training is going to make us more of who we're meant to be.
Wow. You know, in a slightly different direction, I heard recently Alex Jones, founder of Hallow, the super popular app, I think the most popular app in existence in the world right now. I heard him talking about fasting. I'm probably misquoting, but I think he said something along the lines of to turbocharge your prayer life, that you want to pray for somebody, fast and pray for them.
Yes.
Don't just pray for them.
Yes.
Speak to that as a tool.
Sure. The 20th century monk, Thomas Merton, phrased that insight in this way. He said, when we fast from what people would think of as the usual hungers, it's at the service of liberating the deeper hungers, ultimately our hunger for God, where we're actually bringing our whole life to the Lord in the poverty of our fasting, asking the Lord for something new. And here another practical tip for fasting might be helpful. For example, during the season of Lent, to focus on those foods that serve our mission. So the foods that don't serve our mission, we put those to the side. Still more the foods that interfere with our mission. So to think through, all right, what rhythm of eating and drinking is best going to serve my mission, and then the other stuff I put aside. Stuff that is just genuinely bad for us, we eliminate that, even if it means over time, progressively. The things that are more neutral treats, well, we save those for feast days. And what's beautiful about that is that the church is always giving us something delicious to look forward to. So it's possible to live today going without, knowing that in the future, perhaps the near future, there's going to be a greater joy, and we enjoy it. I love chocolate, and so, eating chocolate every day of the year, all right, has its limited enjoyments with diminishing returns. But to go for a time without that good, when one does enjoy it, associated with a particular feast, one is first of all enjoying the chocolate more, but it's also linked to something that is intrinsically worth celebrating, whether it's Christmas, Easter, etc. And I've found that helpful. And in my own life, just to be autobiographical, I was a very finicky eater growing up. I did not like most vegetables, especially peas. Broccoli wasn't even an option. Let's just stick with peas. I hated it. I used to try to feed them to the dog. My mom saw this and then made cheese peas, which were much more difficult to get off the plate. So when I was a sophomore, I lived in Italy on a study abroad program, and it was the first time in my life where I had to eat what was served me or starve. And guess what? My palate got expanded. For the first time, I saw eggplant and ate eggplant and learned to love eggplant and peas and all the rest. So fasting is intrinsically linked with the broadening of our sense of enjoyment. The saying, hunger is the best sauce. It naturally serves to help us enjoy more things that are good for us.
But thinking about prayer, and we'll do prayer
Yes.
of the threesome in another episode. But do you think there is this focusing maybe of prayer? Is your prayer better when you're fasting?
Sure.
When there's a hunger literally inside you?
Yeah. This is a multidimensional answer because at multiple levels, it is the case. So first of all, fasting calms the body. After the initial frantic
Jitters.
The body calms down, especially if good food is substituted for what we're leaving behind. So the first is the calming of the body. And then, as you might imagine, think of like a cheetah in the wild, not having had much to eat, Well, it also focuses the mind. The cheetah is going to be hyper focused in a way that uh, a cheetah with a belly full of prey
Mm.
is not going to be mentally focused. So it also improves the focus. There's a certain solidarity with other people who are suffering. We can understand from within something of what it is for other people to be in need. And I also think that it propels us um, beyond the mundane, because if we're always on the lookout for what's going to benefit me most immediately, moment to moment, um, it interferes with focusing on someone beyond myself, upon the Lord. So the time that we're not spending in our predictable rhythms, with our predictable satisfactions, is opening up extra time, and it's creating deeper desire uh, to be about the things of the Lord.
Mm. So a great focusing tool for our prayer.
Yes. And it's also penitential in the sense that it really is the reordering
Mm.
of our appetites, which can be really disordered. And
Mm.
so, again, it's not simply about improved health, it's not simply about mindfulness, but there is also an element of retraining our body in the disciplines of authentic love,
Mm.
which is ecstatic, taking us out of ourselves, literally, rather than drawing to ourselves satisfactions on our own terms.
Well, it's fascinating. It changes the perspective here at the beginning of Lent.
Yes.
Maybe, hopefully.
Well, we'll see. And the practical advice that is given in a book like Eat, Fast, and Feast, very practical advice about things like how to begin fasting and how that can look, um, is really helpful. So this podcast isn't about the nuts and bolts of how to do this. It's about the horizon of meaning that the Lord gives to the church, so that we could understand that this is what it is to be alive in Christ. Jay Richards points out that babies tend to have more aggressive feeding schedules than people when they get older, and people who are elderly have a much reduced appetite,
Mm.
and that those varying rhythms are actually natural.
Mm.
And so, in the church's following of Christ throughout the liturgical year, observing these different rhythms of feasting and fasting are essential for practicing, grappling with, being trained in what it is to be human. Because if we realize that this movement in our life is going to take different forms at different seasons of our life, we're in a much better position to realize that each of these periods of our life is a gift from the Lord.
Mm.
Let me just give one example to underline this. Jay Richards points out in the book that in some types of illnesses, the body naturally loses its appetite. And there are various health benefits that can accrue to that loss of appetite in the immune system's battle. If we've already had a certain experience of fasting when we're healthy, it can make our going through periodic sicknesses, in a sense, easier.
Mm.
We're less intimidated by different setbacks. And so the benefits of, in a sense, the radical going without and then the delightful celebration, it's actually meant to train us even for ordinary time when we may have to go for a time, I don't know, parents of small children, where talk about a fasting that's built in, where they're taking care of this, taking care of that, and they realize, oh my gosh, when was the last time I ate anything? Or dad eating the heel of the bread, as my dad did, because we would never eat the heel of the bread. Which gets us to, in the gospel, it's on the Friday of the first week of, the Friday after Ash Wednesday, basically today, where the Pharisees look at the apostles and they ask Jesus, well, why don't they fast? And the Pharisees are talking about the different dietary regulations that the rabbis would argue about. And the answer is because their fasting, the apostles' fasting, is actually more radical. Throughout the gospel, the apostles regularly don't have enough to eat because Jesus is going here and sending them there. And they have to go begging house to house for people to offer hospitality. They're listening to the Sermon on the Mount, and they're regularly coming to Jesus and saying, Lord, it's getting late and evening is coming. Could you send the people home so that we could have our supper? So the fasting is mission determined. And in the life of the church, the sacrifices that we make in the different seasons of our life are participations in the one perfect sacrifice of Christ, who hungers and thirsts for love of our love, for us to share in the wedding feast of the Lamb that doesn't end.
This is amazing advice. Hopefully listeners, especially this one, can make this the greatest Lent ever. And we've certainly started on the journey the right way, it sounds.
Great.
Yeah. Viewers, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We hope we've helped you think about the rest of your Lenten journey. We're just a few days in. We hope we've made you think differently about fasting, perhaps. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again. We'll try to get back to you very soon with another episode on the next of the 3 disciplines of Lent. If there's something you'd like to hear, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at church@stv.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Please share this podcast with everybody you know, especially during this Lenten season. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll be back soon with another episode of After the Homily. Thank you.